It's a great pleasure for me to wish you all welcome to this book seminar organized by the Political Ecology Forum at the Norwegian University of Life Sciences, NMBU. And this forum is a newly established forum to provide a platform for presentations, debate, and dissemination of political ecology work. So, and this is actually our first book seminar. So we've just established this forum, and there is a website, by the way, politicalecology.space that you may visit as well. And the book that we will discuss today is, as you know, Bram Büscher's book, The Truth About Nature, Environmentalism in the Era of Post-Truth Politics and Platform Capitalism. And it's a great pleasure to have Bram with us here today. So he will give a short presentation of the book in a minute or two. But first, let me say a few words about Bram and the panel of three discussants. So Bram Büscher is, first of all, one of the leading scholars in the field of political ecology today, and in particular on the issue of political ecology of conservation. He's also a very productive scholar, and for instance, last year he published this book here with Rob Fletcher, with the title The Conservation Revolution, Radical Ideas for Saving Nature Beyond the Anthropocene. And then this year he's published the book that we will discuss here today. So Bram is professor and chair of the Sociology of Development and Change group at Wageningen University in the Netherlands. And he's also one of the editors of the open access journal Conservation and Society. Then we have three discussants with us today. First, we have Erik Gómez-Baggethun, who is a professor at NMBU. His research focuses on ecological economics, and he's also the vice president of the European Society for Ecological Economics. He was a lead author of the report, The Economics of Ecosystems and Biodiversity, the so-called TEEB report, and has served as an expert for the Intergovernmental Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, IPBES, which is, as many of you would know, the parallel to the IPCC, but on biodiversity. He also leads a new initiative at NMBU called the Sustainability Arena, which is actually also co-sponsoring this event. Then we have Melanie Sommerville, who is a tenure-track postdoc at NMBU, and who joined us last year from Canada, where she did a PhD at the University of British Columbia, and later a postdoc at the Geography Department at the University of Toronto. And finally, we have Knut Nustad, who is a professor and anthropologist, and a former chair of the Department of Social Anthropology at the University of Oslo. And he has also previously worked several years at NMBU, so he's a former colleague of us. I should also say that both Melanie and Knut have for many years focused on issues of conservation in South Africa, which is also the key theme in the book we will discuss today. And before I invite Bram to present his book, I should also add that this event is being recorded, and that after the comments from the discussants and Bram's first responses, we will open up for questions from all of you. You may then either put your questions in the chat or raise your virtual hand, and Noah Mendoza will help us keep track of the questions in the chat. So then it's a pleasure to invite Bram to give an introduction to the book for about 20 minutes.
Great. Well, thanks so much, Tor, to you, to Noah, and of course to the Political Ecology Forum at the Norwegian University of Life Sciences for organizing this book seminar, and especially also to Erik, Melanie, and Knut for engaging with the book. I very much look forward to the discussion, and hence will try to keep my introductory remarks brief, not only because you asked me to do so, Tor, but also because I'm actually more interested in highlighting just several points in the book rather than outlining the whole argument, which in any event is a bit too complex for one presentation. I have noted. I've tried that a couple of times, and I felt that didn't really work. So the central problematic that animates the book is how to understand, communicate, and sort of politicize the major environmental crises that beset the world today. And this responds to a major and rather sort of tragic irony that we also see in the world today, that we have more and more knowledge about the natural world and our interactions with and impacts on it. In fact, we've arguably never had more knowledge than we have today, and much of it is rather close to, for most of us, just a few clicks away. But at the same time, most of us, or many of us at least, feel that all this knowledge and incredible circulation of information in today's world makes us understand the world less rather than more, right? And new media, new online media and digital platforms are really central to this overload, what Mark Andreevich aptly referred to as info glut. And hence it's crucial to critically engage with platforms, even though, or I would guess especially because this is not yet that often done in political ecology. So this is not only important to understand the possibilities for communicating and politicizing environmental crisis, but also, and especially because these new digital platforms, these new digital media represent a novel form of capitalist power that preys on and exploits our needs to connect and be heard. It allows us all to connect, but increasingly less to build meaningful relationships. And it makes it seem as though we are heard, but in actual fact, we often find no resonance from the other, often merely echoes of ourselves, facilitated by likes and shares. All of which in turn make it even harder to continue to have some bearings and to give direction, to the world we are in. So with all the noise, pressure, ideas about collapse, the crises that are going on, how can we still focus? And how can we think and act meaningfully? And how can political ecology help in all of this? So I think my book really centrally speaks to these questions. And in order to address them, I want to briefly touch on 3 issues. First, how to deal with the truth about the environmental crisis. Second, why truth matters and what is its relation to power. And third, how can political ecology help to make truth productive? So first, how to deal with the truth, about the environmental crisis. Now, we all know that more and more information is not truth. In fact, it's the opposite of truth. It is in today's world basically data. I hear some. It is in today's world basically data, right? Data is information that something happened. And because we can now store and circulate all this information, we actually have lots and lots of it, right? Big data. Yet data are still trivial, right? The trivial, meaningless notations that something happened. They mean nothing in and of themselves. But now that data have become big, they seem to have become magic to some actors, right? Many scientists increasingly seem to think that now that data is big, it is supposed to be able to almost speak for itself. See, the data says so. There's a crisis. We must act now. Many platforms, platform capitalists likewise have found a way to turn data into capital, which is also a form of magic, right? Capital seems to magically multiply itself by making more of itself. And of course, it makes some people in corporations tremendously rich and powerful. But of course, even they, right, scientists and platform capitalists and others know that data do not really become capital or speak for themselves just like that. Data, information that something happened, must be turned into knowledge. Information why something happened. And clearly we have lots of that as well, right? We have lots of knowledge flying around the internet. And most of us understand a lot about why environmental crises occur. So for example, just trivial examples, obviously, we know that CO2 chiefly comes from burning fossil fuels, and that we should do rather less of that if we want to have, a real impact in tackling climate change. We know that biodiversity loss mainly comes from changing land use practices, and hence that we should rethink how we do that and the activities that lead to land use change in order to avoid species extinctions, for example. So many of us know this, we have that knowledge, though unfortunately having ever more of that has not really helped us to avert or even really make a major dent in addressing the major environmental crises of our time. So there are 2 reasons for this. And the first, as political ecologists know so well, of course, is that environmental crises writ large relate very uncomfortably to the messy realities of specific places, peoples, and their contexts, right? So indeed, political ecology has been critical in teaching all of us how macro crises relate to grounded realities and vice versa, and how many proposed mainstream solutions do not actually really tackle the roots of these relations. So the second reason is one I believe political ecology is also quite good at, but at the same time needs to cultivate much more, and much more explicitly, namely to turn this incredible knowledge into a quest for truth. So to many political ecologists, including many inspired by STS, science and technology studies, or actor network theory, etc., just saying that almost sounds like heresy, right? Truth is supposed to be deconstructed, put consistently between quotation marks. And as Latour would have it, truth is just an arrogant way of giving superficial weight to discursive battles. So I argue in this book actually that we need to rethink this stance, and for two reasons. Because first, if indeed there is truth in the socio-ecological crisis of the world, we would be foolish to ignore this. And second, because of the rise of post-truth. So I would venture that many of us, don't really like post-truth tendencies, whatever we think they may mean. But so far that, at least in political ecology, has not really led to a renewed appreciation for truth. And hence I come to the second part of my talk, why truth matters and its relation to power. So the first reason why truth matters is that it helps political ecology turn knowledge into understanding. So what does that mean? It means, following Hannah Arendt, transcending knowledge by making it meaningful. Right? So knowledge is information why stuff happens, but actually understanding makes knowledge meaningful. And meaning is for Hannah Arendt precisely the difference between knowledge and understanding, something that digital platforms can never do, and why in the end they are utterly meaningless. So making knowledge meaningful, I believe, entails relating it to positionality, context, and history. And these three elements are critical and help us to transcend knowledge and turn it into a deeper understanding. And it helps us, all of us who've done long-term fieldwork within particular contexts, communities, and their histories, to get a sense or a feel for an area or a problem, to get in touch with what Hannah Arendt calls the common or the popular, the everyday dynamics, rituals, and language that allows people to give meaning to their lives. So for this reason, I delved deep into the context and histories and positionalities of environmental issues and interventions in South Africa, in the book, in Southern Africa, right? To really give color, depth, and meaning to environmental crises and their proposed solutions, or sometimes so-called solutions. But in doing so, I also note in the book that any idea of the truth about nature, and here I use quotation marks quite deliberately, or environmental crises, seems to dissipate in those messy complexities of local contexts, histories, and positionalities. And this is precisely the point, right? As that helps us to gain a deeper understanding. And this understanding is incredibly powerful, and this is why political ecology is so important. But understanding is not power. Rather, I would argue it's the basis of moving to truth, which, of course, as Foucault famously noted, truth is always power. And hence, here's the second reason why truth matters. Because it gets us close to power, or to understanding power. And this obviously, again, gets us to the heart of political ecology, of course, as Tor and Anna have also powerfully argued and will further expand on next week in their book seminar, right? Political ecology is always about how to place ecology in relation to politics and power. And so if truth is power, and political ecology wants to study power, why has it lately been so afraid of the idea of truth? And with lately, I actually mean the last couple of decades. So one reason is totally legitimate, right? Because truth claims often hide power and how they are used, or rather abused, right? So challenging truths in this sense also means challenging power. And I think most of us work in that vein, and that's really utterly important. But the other side is rarely entertained, that truth can also be productive. Foucault, of course, famously argued that that power is not just negative, that it can be positive and productive. So what if it can be positive? So what if truth could be equally productive, right? What if it can be positive in the meaning that Foucault ascribed to it, that it can facilitate, not just repress, that it can afford, and that it can provide meaning, and that indeed it can do all these things at the same time, which I've tried to capture by developing a metaphysics of truth tensions in the book. So I never argue in the book for a political ecology of truth. And the political ecology of truth makes truth productive, not only by studying power, but by speaking it to power. And this, I believe, creates further meaning in two critical ways that I want to discuss in the third and now final part of this talk. How can political ecology make truth productive? First, speaking truth to power makes explicit how understanding, that what takes into account context, history, and positionality, aims to make a difference. And it does so precisely by placing the hegemonic power of a specific time within contexts, histories, and in relation to different positionalities and what effects it has. And it's this act that makes us realize and see that structural change is possible. And indeed, if the effects are as disastrous as they are with, the hegemonic powers of today, that structural change is necessary. And the basis of all of this is still always the study of power and how it continues to change. So this is why I spent another, good part of the book investigating the relations between digital platforms, nature, and power. And I conclude in that part that post-truth itself is an expression of platform power. That post-truth is literally post-truth, beyond truth, in that truth doesn't matter anymore. And Antoinette Ruffin captures that nicely. She says that algorithmic knowledge is knowledge without truth. And so if this form of power, platform power, holds knowledge without truth, how can it ever help us, right, by circulating so much more of this, to tackle the truth about the environmental predicament that we're in? Clearly, it cannot, right? The only thing it does, as noted in the beginning, is to circulate more and more information and knowledge while helping us feel that we understand less and less. Now, this is a dead end if there ever was one. And so I want to make a passionate plea, which I try to do in the book, for understanding and confronting platform power in order to enable structural change. Second, and concluding, speaking truth to power creates meaning by providing direction and bearings. It allows, following somebody who I've been reading quite a lot of late, the Korean philosopher Byung-Chul Han, for using the power of critique to build narratives that give meaning and direction to the unfolding of the world. So in short, it organizes time. So platforms do the opposite. They do not organize time. They organize the dissipating of time into endless, meaningless, and even addictive scrolling. Right? To organize time, Byung-Chul Han argues, you need narrative, you need rituals and stability in the process of it all. It's akin to what a home is in space, a house. So rituals and narratives, according to him, allow for building a home in time. And I think political ecology still has a lot of work to do here. But I trust that it will take up this call very seriously. And in fact, I think this seminar is exactly an example of this. After all, one important ritual in academia is to take time to listen to each other, to hear each other, and through in-depth discussion to help each other move from knowledge to a deeper and meaningful understanding that can understand, transcend, and confront power. So it's therefore at this point that I want to conclude and stop and gladly listen to and learn from Erik, Melanie, and Knut's reflections. Thank you so much.
Thanks, thanks a lot, Bram, also for being relatively short, on time, and clear. Of course, challenging truth, that challenging truth implies challenging power, I think, is something that many of us working within the field of political ecology have experienced when we have challenged truth claims about environmental degradation or participation or whatever. So this is really at the core of the field of political ecology. But it's tempting for me to start asking you questions now, but I think I'll just, instead of anticipating the questions from or comments from the discussants, I think I'll just hand over to Erik first to give his comments.
Thanks to Rarve, and thanks to Rarve and Noe for the invitation, and thanks so much, Bram, for your presentation. And I'm really glad to have the opportunity to discuss with you, and I really enjoyed this reading very much. So congratulations for the book is the first thing I would like to say. And it's a book that I liked, and I have many notes here, but I would maybe focus on three aspects that I found particularly interesting in your book. The first one is its relevance and its timeliness. No, I think it was important to have a book on that makes a strong criticism of online activism. It's not the first book that addresses this, but it's the first book I see it addressing it in a strong way in the particular case of environmental activism. And as one of those weirdos that has decided to stay away from social media, I found your book reassuring. So I find interesting not only this intuition that many of us have had that very likely this online activism is ineffective, but you push this argument one step further, making the case that it may not only be ineffective, but it can also be a strengthening mechanism of the status quo by strengthening dynamics of post-truth and corporate capitalism. So I think this is extremely important. It's a sort of elephant in the room. I think many people give thinking to this idea, but it was very good to see this written and elaborated in an articulate way. So this is one of the contributions I enjoyed very much of your book. The chapters that I enjoyed the most are the opening and the closing chapters, where you elaborate on all these discussions around truth, ontologies, and so on. And I found very insightful how you draw on Hannah Arendt to make this distinction between facts, knowledge, and understanding. I have read quite a bit Hannah Arendt, but I was not aware of this insight from her work, where you use the idea of understanding to see how, or the importance of context, historical situation, and positionalities as a way to move from knowledge to understanding. No, I found this very, very interesting. But maybe the aspect that I enjoyed most of your book is to see a critical theorist in the 21st century making a defense of truth. This is a very rare thing to see in nowadays. No, it's in critical theory, making a defense of truth is almost a taboo nowadays. No, and also in the field of the environment, I guess this is to some extent politically, ecologically incorrect. So it's something that I really enjoyed seeing. This I found very interesting. This idea of truth tensions in dialectical language that I interpret as a kind of synthesis that allows to overcome entrenched and often unproductive positions or discussions between, the sort of hard realist perspective of natural scientists saying these are the facts, we have to act accordingly, and the other side of the spectrum where this that focus on only the idea of truth as power and then end up only deconstructing truth. No, so this idea that that truth is worth fighting for, even if you make the humble case that we may not arrive to truth, or we actually cannot arrive to truth in the way you put it. I find it extremely valuable. So overall, I very much enjoyed this reading. I have many questions, but I maybe only throw 2 or 3, and just as maybe food for thought. I don't need a sort of immediate answer, but maybe you can build on that later. The first one is that like you make a defense of truth. Sometimes I have the feeling you could have pushed it a little bit further, in the sense that making a defense of truth in the atmosphere of critical theory is so difficult that you almost end up doing a kind of apologetic defense of truth, no? So I was interested in the idea, you say at some point, I think it was in page 29, or no, where is it? In 15, that objective truth does not exist. At some point in the beginning of your book, you make this distinction between truth with capital letter, truth with colons, and so on, where I was hoping maybe you would elaborate a bit further in the book, which are the domains of constructed truth and which are the domains of genuine objective truth, if there is any, no? And one book that was coming to my mind, and that I will give you, if you don't have it, if you come to Norway, is Ibsen's Enemy, the People's Enemy. I don't know if you read that book, but it's a very interesting 19th century account on the interrelations between nature, truth, and power, just as your book does, no? Not least with a strong connection to the role of media. And this book is very interesting because it's about a doctor that finds that the water, the spring waters of a village that will bring prosperity to the local population, he finds that they are polluted, they are contaminated. So he tries to tell truth, which is that they are contaminated and they cannot build this business. And then all the factual powers, including the media and so on, build an alternative truth through power to make the case that, after all, this is not true, and so on. No? But in Ibsen's account, there's this case that actually there is a domain for objective truth. These waters are actually polluted, no? And this is maybe the bit that I missed a little bit more in your book. If you could elaborate on which are these sort of solid rock, not only the interface between the solid rock and the moving sands, but which is, when it comes to the environment, this part of the solid rock where we can have a more sort of stronger connections to truth. Well, another question that I have for you is if you could shed a little bit more of thinking on how to break this vicious cycle you referred to when it comes to the use of media to try to counter post-truth, but at the same time it strengthens post-truth, no? So I was wondering if in the end you would come with the idea that we have to escape social media, you know, in the Heidegger's idea that, you know, escaping technology, or we would have to sort of rethink these technologies to use them and to redirect them for emancipatory purposes. No? So you seem in the end of the book to go for the second, to suggest the second alternative. But I would be very interested to hear a bit more on how this could actually be done. One thing that I also wanted to ask you is, in your defense of truth, you end up doing a kind of quite instrumental reasoning of why truth matters, no? By making the case that it can be productive to challenge power and so on. But is there an intrinsic value in truth? I haven't thought too much about this, but I have the intuition that truth may have an intrinsic value in itself, that we do not only need to grasp instrumental arguments to justify its importance, no? And finally, Bram, and since Turarve mentioned that this is also a joint initiative with a new project we're studying at an NMU called the Sustainability Arenas. And this is connected to a project called Embedding Planetary Boundaries in Science Policy and Education. And you might be aware of this virtual forum going on in the Journal of Political Geography, where there is a discussion on degrowth, limits, and scarcity, triggered by this keynote from that you in the Poland conference. You were around, Bram, so you might remember.
By Paul Robbins.
By Paul Robbins. So I'm very interested if you could say some words about how this this discussion on truth and power plays out in the question of environmental limits. I find it very interesting how the idea, next year it will be 50 years since the publication of Limits to Growth. And I'm very interested in how the conception of limits has evolved from the conception of a sort of hard physical reality to the idea that it's you know, a constructed concept, that it's malleable through technology and institutions, an idea that we have seen very strange convergence of, you know, mainstream economics with political ecology, and even now also some prominent degrowth spokesmen making the case that there are no external physical limits, that all this is about, you know, in relation to human choices and aspirations and so on. So if you could say something about that, that would be very interesting. Thanks so much, Bram. I look forward to keep discussing.
Yeah, thanks a lot to you as well, Erik. I think those are some questions going right to the heart of Bram's book, and so I think maybe I'll ask you to, you know, keep the answers to until after Melanie and Knut, because otherwise we will end up in a long discussion now before going to the next comments. So I think I'll just invite Melanie to continue.
Great, you guys can hear me?
Yeah. Okay,
good. We had problems with sound earlier. So good morning, everyone. Nice to see you. And thanks to Arve for inviting me to participate, and Noe for keeping us organized, and Bram for a great book. It's a really compelling read that I think manages to balance empirics and rigorous analysis, which is no small feat in and of itself. And even as someone who's done a fair amount of work in South Africa, as Torabbe mentioned, I learned quite a lot, which is great. And the book's also very well organized and highly readable, which seems like a weird compliment, except that so much of academic work isn't. So yeah, congratulations to you, or kudos to you for that. So my comments, I've sort of structured them on a couple of things that I really liked or appreciated or found resonant about the book. One thing that I might have liked to see a little bit more of, and then two sort of questions for you. Of course, I have, you know, many more questions than that. And Bram, I'm happy to share. I have notes about this, so I'm happy to share that with you later, in case, you know, if there are things that you want to come back to. And I'll try to keep my eye on the time to make sure I don't go too much over 10 minutes anyways. So starting with some parts that I really liked. The first is that I deeply appreciated your argument that post-truth is not about sort of individual disrespect or disregard for the facts, right? That it's rather a particular expression of structural power. When I read that, I felt that kind of particular relief that one feels when you read something that you know is accurate. I almost used the word true there, you know, but since that's what we're questioning. And similarly, I think, you know, following with what Erik has said, that your argument that it's productive to sort of situate truth in this tension between sort of shifting sands or solid rock, and then to constantly sort of challenge and reconsider what we understand as true on that basis. I think this is really great stuff. I also think, you know, since Erik and I both happen to be in the same department, Norwegian and NMBU, it's a really nice fit for our department because we have, you know, both environmental economists, much like Erik, who sort of are keen to draw attention to the hard truth of environmental decline, and then critical social scientists like me, who are a bit more like, well, it's not that simple, right? So, and I think you nicely sort of cover that tension in your book. Another thing that I really liked is your point about how, on the one hand, these sort of new forms of social media, you know, if we can still call them new, obviously they're, you know, constantly evolving, but They can make nature more available or more viewable or even sort of more experienceable, both by the conservation minded, but then also sort of hopefully a wider audience. But at the same time, they also reinforce existing and problematic power dynamics. So, you know, the clearest example I think of this is in your chapter on the Kruger, where you point out how these sort of wildlife cams and Facebook groups and the Sandpark forums and this latest sightings app, they seem to kind of make the boundaries of the park more permeable on the one hand, but they do so in a way that reinforces this kind of racialized and unequal class hierarchies that are very typical of sort of fortress conservation in South Africa, right? So this speaks to, I think, a point about continuity and change, which is something that I'll come back to later, because in a sense, it's sort of like tout ça change, or, you know, everything old is new again, sort of thing. And then the third thing that I really liked is that I appreciated your humility as a scholar. In the book, you're quite honest throughout about the partiality of your data, and I think you're appropriately cautious about drawing conclusions from it. I mean, you're also honest about the challenges that, you know, your research posed. I had to laugh when you said, you know, I think in the preface to the book that your project nearly succumbed to centrifugal forces as your aim and questions expanded. I think, you know, many of us will have had that experience or a project or two along those lines. And for the rest of us, you know, more of this humility, please. I think we really have to balance the arrogance and the kind of self-assuredness that characterizes a very large proportion of academic writing, because this too is politics, right? Okay, so I mentioned that there was one thing that I would have liked to see a little bit more of. And this regards your point that platform capitalism focuses on the production of data, and that the truthfulness of a particular data point does not particularly matter, that fact or sort of alternative fact, you know, it's all data, right? And that this data in turn is used to generate. So my question was, or is, but how? So I appreciate that you sort of mentioned algorithms, etc., but this doesn't actually tell us much about how this results in money for the platforms involved or for the other groups that are involved. So for example, the one that I sort of personally have, you know, limited understanding of is that Facebook generates advertising revenue, right? Some of which, much of which I assume the corporation keeps, and then some of it is distributed to whomever posts the video, right? Or etc. But what about these other kinds of sort of virtual natures that you talk about, like conservation, video games, etc., right? So, you know, I think my comment here is sort of inspired by the fact that I do a lot of work with critical work on finance, basically. And in that field, scholars have been really focused on opening the black boxes, is the term that's always used, that characterize financial activity. But so too must we do this for platforms. We have to dissolve the magic, as you kind of put it in your opening comments, of data and its role in contemporary political economy. So I think that makes for a really nice segue to my questions for you. I have two that I'll mention here. The first is about political economy, and the second is about racialization. So the first question is that, in general, you're very cautious throughout the book in the claims that you make about politics. So for example, you're constantly reaffirming to readers that, you know, these practices of distinction in the chapter on Kruger, or the you know, practices of hysteria, or at least emotions running high in the chapter on rhino poaching, they're not entirely new, even as they might be sort of enrolled in new political forms now, right? But I worry that you lose a little bit of that caution when it comes to political economy. And I guess my question is, do you see platform capitalism as a wholesale replacement of whatever stage, and we could put different names on it, right, came before it? I think it's really important to recognize that the different actors involved in the sort of networks or systems that you study, they have different aims and they operate according to different profit models as well. So for a platform, it is generating data, although, as I mentioned before, like to what end is not always clear in the book. But for the conservation agencies involved, so taking the WWF as sort of a prime example, you say that it's about kind of driving behavioral change. Although I would argue that it's maybe more accurately about raising money to continue their activities through which they hope to change people's behavior. In a sense, I think these organizations are attempting to engage with our changed behavior. So the fact that we're spending more time on screens and all of that, so that they can continue on with business as usual. And in fact, one of your informants says this, fairly directly. So I think it's on page 100 that you cite Safari Central, part of this Internet of Elephants, who say that, and I quote, "It can be a constant struggle for wildlife conservation organizations to keep their existing donors truly engaged, develop for future donor pipelines, bring attention to their work, and educate local and global audiences." So they're fairly, they're foregrounding the need to raise money there, right? So in short, even if there's change in this sort of, platform capitalism, aren't there also important continuities, I guess? So that's my first question. My second question, as I mentioned, is about racialization. So in your book, you focus on a certain instability that exists with respect to facts about nature, and the social and, of course, environmental dangers or repercussions of that instability. And I don't disagree with you on that point at all. But at the same time that facts about nature have become, or maybe are becoming, less stable, facts about race, which I would argue are also a kind of fact about nature, or facts about nature, seem to be becoming ever more concrete. So it is that we now even have critical scholars or associated forms of social Darwinism. What I mean by those terms is the resurgence of ideas that Blacks are different from whites by their nature, or that the poor are somehow just less evolved than than the wealthy, although they might, of course, be rehabilitated. So I'm being a bit, simplistic or crude in my language here, but then sometimes things are, and certainly I think these divides of race and class, as you note, they really resonate in South Africa. So I guess my question on that point is, what do you make of this disjunct, that nature is destabilized, even as race, again, a kind of nature, or it can be seen as a type of nature, stabilizes, or is being stabilized, or how should we understand it, since obviously the onus doesn't lie sort of entirely on you. So maybe I'll leave it there. I have a million other questions for you, but as I said, I can follow up with email. So.
Thanks a lot, Melanie. So now, Bram, you have a good set of questions, but I would ask you to hold your breath for another, waiting for Knut's comments as well, and then you will have the chance to respond. So please, Knut.
Thank you, and as others said, thank you so much for creating this event, Tor Arve, and for all of you for joining, and for Bram to presenting. I really enjoyed engaging with the book, and I'll try to make it slightly easier for you, Bram, by connecting the questions to something that has already been said. I might have an unstable internet connection. If you don't hear me right, let me know, and I'll move closer to the server. Like the other two, what I really took away from this, Bram, really enjoyed and made me sit up. When like the two other speakers, I had suspected that post-truth and Trumpism wasn't just an accident happening now, that it must be some kind of systematic reasoning behind that. But I haven't really had the time to look into it. But you spelled it out so clear. Why this is an effect of the development of capitalism. So that I really enjoyed that part of your book, and you also then really showed why this matters for the topic that you are discussing. I also really, like Melanie said, the way you managed to write this in a clear and easy way is really an accomplishment. And this is a book that can engage many people, and I think that is what you were meaning to do as well. I will also limit my comments to 3 points. One is more of a question. Another one is more about following up from what Melanie said, older debates that I think underlie this and might challenge how new this is, but then again, not really. That's not the main point. As you say, this is an accentuation of something new. And then pointing to development in STS and my own work that I think parallels what you're doing. So starting with the more simple, straightforward question, right? You said, and I think Erik actually picked up on that as well. The first part of your book lays out the more theoretical structural argument in a very Foucauldian / Marxist way. I mean, this is how power is situated. There doesn't really seem to be an outside to this power. And then you contrast that with your empirical cases, where you show how this plays out in reality, right? In your different cases, in Kruger, in conservation, and elephants and whatnot. What you don't really do in those cases is to show that there is an outside in the meaning of resistance to it. I mean, they are, okay, it's not straightforwardly played out, but the effects are completely as predicted by your model. So my first question is this: do you see an outside to this kind of power that it's possible to engage? Examples would be, perhaps the most simple one, use of social media to organize protests in Hong Kong. Is that both generating data and mobilizing support? The Exxon oil spill that happened online, which many people have written about. That was, some people argue, I guess people more positive to the internet than we are, was a almost not a fake, but an augmented reality event that created activism. I mean, the oil spill was modeled in graphics, so people could sort of see what happened with the oil spill online through computer modeling, right? Sort of augmented social media activity. Or more simply put, when we post and it generates click and information, I mean, what is the relationship between generating just click and noise and that you describe and the actual content? So that's my first question about the possibilities for an outside here. And as you know, this is an old Foucauldian question. Then to how this differs from previous discussions. And I think one point there is you don't really have a lot of space to elaborate on your conception of nature, obviously, because, I mean, as you know, you could have written a volume about that as well. But you don't really touch on the idea of nature as a category that in and of itself separates humans and environments, which is one way of conceptualizing nature, as you know, right? And you point to, on page 19, I think it is, you say the previous social constructivist debates of the 1990s. And I think in a way they are quite instructive. When I had a lot of fun reading those in a South African context when I read responses. I was working in the St. Lucia area, and they had an environmental impact assessment that included social scientists, I think, for the first time. And these people wrote a complete social constructivist idea about why nature mattered in South Africa. And people were up in arms, as you can imagine. I mean, what are you doing? So they, but it's an interesting debate to see what happened there, because these social scientists were idea, and even pointed to the dualism of social constructivism in a sense, which not many people did at the time, i.e. they were saying so nature is socially constructed and have many different social constructions because there is one objective nature out there, which you can't really grasp. And that has been Latour's point and other criticisms of that view as well. You need nature to be external and stable in order to have different constructions, right? And as you know, you had the 2000s with Viveros de Castro and people who sort of went on about multi-natures and all that. And in a way, the response from the conservationists seemed to align with that, because they said there is no duality. Nature is there, it's completely independent of what we think about it. It has intrinsic nature value, in a sense that seemed to align with new theories in a sense. So sort of thinking about why is this different? And the difference, I thought at that time, is that they have what you could call a reality absolute view of nature. I mean, they don't open up for different ways of construing that nature. There's only one way of treating nature. And this is back to, I'm sorry for the roundabout here, this is back to your facts about nature. It's very similar in a sense, to insist that there's only one way of seeing nature. And that is being outside it, treating it with respect, not touching it, not have people living inside it. So that round of discussions, which did not take place in social media, sort of ended up in a very similar kind of way, right? That attempts to show diversity and difference were countered by an absolutist view of this is a fact. When we are not going to discuss this at all. And that also links to other points you made in your book, but you don't really connect to this about, for instance, nature film and documentaries, which tend to treat nature in exactly this way, right? I mean, your standard overviewing of a flying of nature, where the disembodied position where you sort of see nature as completely external to what is happening with humans. So this is more of a comment than a question, right? It's just showing that same kind of processes, I think, happened a decade earlier, but as you say, probably accentuated by new media. Last point is just pointing to a parallel, which I found, and that sort of goes to your solution to this as well. I'm not going to quarrel with your reading of Foucault. I think you're quite right, especially of early Foucault. Some would say that he has probably or perhaps turned around in his later writings on Gaia. And when he started to talk about climate change, when the world seems to become real for him, there seemed to be power. There seemed to be something external out there structuring discourses in a different way. I think Anna Tsing at a point said that she much preferred that Latour because he seemed to care about what he was writing about for the first time. Right. So there is a change in his later writings. I wanted to point to a parallel there, as I said. I mean, you said that Foucault also has a notion of power being constructive, right? As most anthropologists have read that, that's not really a positive thing. It's constructive in the sense of constructing subjects, docile subjects, in a sense. And I'm just mentioning that, not to make a point, but just to say that in my discipline, which is more political anthropology, going to environmental anthropology and political ecology out of that, there's been a huge science skepsis because of exactly that kind of reading of Foucault. Because the inversion of what you say, that truth is always power, anthropologists have tended to look at scientists writing about environments as power plays. Right, so the job is to deconstruct this knowledge and then show that there are different ways of understanding the kind of stuff that they're writing about. There's been a huge movement there, and I see myself as part of that, where we sort of learn from political ecology to collaborate much more seriously with the sciences in a way, and take the ontological and epistemological differences seriously. And one way of doing that is what Andrew Matthews and Anna Tsing have put forward as a landscape perspective, where they're trying to combine both Foucauldian notions of landscape, as in Olvig, for instance, with ecological approaches to landscape. I'm involved in a project that right now that tries to do that. For instance, when we're trying to look at the effect of colonial introduction of trout in South Africa and elsewhere. And hadn't COVID happened, what we were proposing to do was to walk a stretch of concrete river with ecologists and anthropologists and discuss what do we see. I mean, I would see layers of dispossession, land ecologies. He would probably see alien species and try to weave these different knowledges together and see and have a discussion about why we see it as differently. And I think this is an alternative approach that very much parallels your shifting sand and stone approach. It's a weaving together of different knowledge productions to create, we haven't used the word truth, but I think it's pretty much what we are after in a sense. By juxtaposing knowledges in that sense and being quite clear about what you see and what you don't see. So those were my one question and two comments.
Great, many thanks, Knut. So Bram, now you have received 3 sets of comments and questions, which I think to some extent represent 3 different readings of your book as well, or at least, 3 different perspectives of your book, even though there are some overlaps between the comments. And I know it's challenging to respond to all this in one go, so we might have some back and forth. So it's up to you how many of these issues you want to raise in the first place. But I invite you to respond to some of this.
Thanks, Tor Arve. Well, thank you, all three of you, for this incredible engagement. I mean, this so it makes it all worthwhile, right? I mean, all of us here know how much time goes into our writing, and how incredibly precious it is to have people devote serious attention to it and engage with it in this kind of way. So, yeah, first of all, thank you, all three of you, for this engagement. I truly appreciate that tremendously. Let me get into a couple of things. Like Tor said, I mean, there's a lot to think about here, and I may not be able to get to all the points mentioned, and I might bring some of the points together, but hopefully then that may trigger some further questions and discussion, and then hopefully we can also maybe get some of the audience involved in this as well, who may have their own thoughts about this and want to contribute. So, first of all, I mean, coming, I think, to one of the core issues that Erik mentioned, and that actually Melanie and Knut also mentioned, and I think Knut kind of ended on that note as well, right? The relation between solid rock and shifting sand, and how, as Melanie said, you can, I think, clearly see in the book that I've been struggling with this from beginning to end. I mean, I will not hide that you know, and I appreciate, you know, Erik, that you say maybe I should have taken it further, right? I should have pushed it a bit harder and have an even stronger defense of truth. But this basically means also confronting my own socialization and like literally everything that I've been taught over the last 20 years, right? It's almost like an identity kind of thing, where you at some point come to the conclusion that maybe this is an argument that you should be making, and then like you're thinking, shit, wow, that has some implications. And I came to that realization in 2016, and the book came out in 2021. So you can kind of see what happened in between, right? So it took a little bit of time to get to that point, but also to read like seriously around some of these discussions. And I highly appreciate the fact that all of you bring that out. I mean, Knut, I think you're absolutely right that the prior discussions, right, the science wars and the big debates about the construction of nature, that basically I treat in a footnote or two, and I mean, I have read quite a bit about this, and I've been really inspired about, you know, with them as well, and how new this is a really good question. I think, you know, I mean, again, Melanie also pointed at the key issue of continuity and change. And I think for us, the key thing as political ecologists is to always be attentive to both of them at the same time, to always study how things change, where they are really new, but not be trapped into some, what I think Papacharizi says, not be trapped in some kind of mythology of the new, right? To see in the new things that continue. And so literally, one of my answers to your point, Knut, would be that, you know, 20 years ago, there wasn't Facebook. There literally wasn't Google, right? I mean, well, that's not true. I mean, I think they started in 1999 or 1998, something around that time, but it wasn't what it is right now. So the fact that these corporations and their platform model became so dominant literally within 10 to 15 years is astonishing, is incredible. And we need to, I think, critically deal with this and confront this in, you know, in new ways, whilst doing justice to the debates that have been there before. And yeah, I mean, this links crucially to the question of race as well, that I want to get to, because I really appreciate, Melanie, that you bring this point up, and I will come to that. But let me first sort of maybe go back to the more general point that Erik raised, that I think both relate to your first point, Erik, about solidity, right, in both knowledge and in terms of how we deal with crisis, but also the last point that you brought up in terms of the discussion on limits, which I must say, I've been enjoying a lot. I mean, this whole discussion, right? In general, I enjoy discussions, and I like the fact that people just try to bring up some, stir up the pot a little bit. So that is cool. But I've also really appreciated Georges Callas's book on limits, right? And I do think I side more with that approach to things, and that's taken me a little while to get there as well. And but it's so speaks to some of the core discussions in the social sciences and social theory more generally, right? The question of distinction, the question of assemblages, the question of, right, dichotomies and all that, in the more than human, post-human, ontological discussions as well. We've seen this tendency to really sort of push, for everything hybrid. And at some point, a lot of people are now saying, more and more people are now saying, well, wait a minute, perhaps we should take limits seriously. And if we do that, it also means we need to take certain forms of very solid knowledge also very seriously. And I must say, I have shifted on this point to I think like the Norwegian University of Life Sciences, right? I mean, that's kind of a university like the one I'm in here, Wageningen. It's really hard to be a very, very, very super critical social scientist here when you're surrounded only by life scientists who keep shouting the truth about nature, like on the top of their lungs the whole time, based on their hard knowledge, right? But so the way I've tried to deal with that is that, yes, certain things can be really hard, right? And I sort of refer to those as facts. But my way of understanding that is that facts become quite meaningless outside of context, history, and positionality, right? So what a lot of scientists do, and that's really problematic, is shouting facts to power. Look, you guys don't understand, like freaking hell, look at this, like species are dying out, and they're right. Look, the temperature is changing, they are right? I think that they are right? I think that, some of that is pretty hard, and it's pretty useless to keep debating some of these things over and over again. There are some points where it comes, if you see it a bit simplistically as a movement from completely constructed to completely solid, right? There are some things that are at some point, things that I think a lot of us can and should accept. And even, if we don't accept them, we need to then live with the consequences, right? I mean, we can also debate, gravity and those kind of things. And then, there have been debates, really cool debates on gravity, how gravity is also constructed. And yet few of us would jump out of a building because, most of us realize, we know, it's kind of a hard fact that we will rather go down than up. So, it has implications for how we behave, right? Certain things clearly have these kind of consequences. And perhaps the importance of the debate, Erik, that you point out, I think, is to get a much better bearing. So ultimately, and that's why I started that discussion, like in the end, the way we deal with that is situated in between our scientific understanding of things, and that means a disciplinary scientific understanding and the epistemological tensions that go with those, and the politics of the moment, right? And of course the historical trajectory of power that undergirds that. And in order to deal with that, we need to at some point also step beyond our own sort of scientific selves and become political actors. I mean, I do think Latour, right, has always thought that, literally at the end of his book in 2005, he does write that science is always politics, but that you shouldn't have to let your science always be driven by politics, and that certain scientific conclusions can come at the expense of your own politics. And to some degree, I felt I've gone through a journey like that. And that kind of journey for me is particularly what makes a difference between speaking fact to power and speaking truth to power, right? It makes things meaningful. It creates a deeper understanding, if you will. And that understanding, let me come to Erik's second point, is for me the difference between an intrinsic value to truth and an instrumental value to truth. I mean, I do think I should have maybe discussed that more, and I it's such an important point. It shouldn't only be instrumental, and I think you are right. There is an intrinsic value to truth, but there's the politics, right? And literally, I will also say that being a white man from the Netherlands, I feel at this point in time, it's not necessarily my place to make that the hardest point of my book. You know, I felt more comfortable in a certain sense. Right? I can really sort of start to bang my head around the intrinsic value of truth, and then others would say, but you know, that's from your perspective. What the hell do you mean? Right? Maybe not necessarily about gravity or temperature change, but certainly about a little bit more contested things like race, like gender, like, you know, other determinants of power that are really critical. But I think we can find each other perhaps a little bit better. But I understand the point that we have to be a bit careful with instrumentalization more generally, but that we can find each other across our differences, in that, you know, we all, in one way or another, right, I think would benefit from, you know, speaking truth to these kind of powers that degrade all of us in various ways, in different ways, right? Very, very different ways. But at the same time, online, all of us are, you know, what I call in the book object subjects that are manipulated for commercial gain. And maybe then to skip, because I don't want to take up too much more time, I just want to maybe discuss two more points, and then I hope I've done justice to at least the main elements and the thrust of most of your comments. Melanie, your point about how does it relate to earlier phases, right? Platform capitalism and this kind of power. And I think this comes back to the point about limits, you know, about hard rock and shifting sand as well, and broader discussions in social theory, and also then about race, which I want to then get to. My argument is that it is a particular type of intensification of all the dynamics. So much more recently, I've submitted, and now that's accepted, written an article that's also taken me years, I must say, at the same time as I was going through this, as a critique of the more than human turn. And one of the things I argue there is that when you look at colonial capitalism and platform capitalism, clearly they're very, very different. But at the same time, they're not completely contingent either. And that's the point about structural power that I want to highlight, right? That under colonial capitalism and under platform capitalism, right, particular forms of degrading both humans and non-humans, right, happen and continue to happen in pursuit of the accumulation of profit. And how that comes about is a really important question. Maybe I'll just park that for now, and maybe we could come back to that a little bit later. But that really sort of combines both of these phases that are, you know, 200-300 so-called 200-300 years apart. But actual fact, right, there are long continuities in all of those. And here I've been really inspired by Achille Mbembe's work, who makes those points, right? I mean, in his book, you know, Critique of Black Reason, he talks about the relation between platform, I mean, he doesn't call it platform capitalism, but the new digital capital and colonial capital, and that it is a further intensification of how both humans and non-humans are degraded under the same system, and how that ultimately means that we need to build post-capitalist platforms, which is the conclusion of the book. So how does that deal with racialization? I think I mentioned a little bit there already. And that speaks to the heart of many questions, you know, in South Africa, but internationally as well. And yes, so like I said before, I've been deliberately a bit careful here, because whether others may agree or not, at this point in time, I don't think it's my position, right? And I feel more comfortable in making certain, in positing certain things a bit harder and certain things a bit more softer, shifting sense, right? And that has to do, I think, with your own politics, right? So certain things with environmental effects, I think, you know, white people, black people, any people are affected but very, very differently, right? Very unevenly. But we can maybe find each other across difference. At the same time, of course, there's a fierce there's a fierce resistance to all of this from status quo forces, if you will, and the fact that scientific racism comes out yet again. I mean, clearly nothing is new, right? I mean, so I've been reading quite a lot on 19th century discussions on exactly that point. I mean, it's frightening how similar those discussions are, right? And not just more generally, but also in relation to environmental issues, right? Particularly in relation to the extinction of species, for example. So, you know, back in the day, in North America, people like Teddy Roosevelt and many others, right, talked about the Nordic white race and how that was under, you know, threat from extinction, right, vis-a-vis Southern Europeans coming in, you know, massively during big immigration waves in the US, and how that directly related to the extinction of certain species. Now we see that almost happening on a global scale, right? So David Hughes, Achille Mbembe, but also others, Winter, have written powerfully about exactly these kind of things, in the sense, you know, in that they, you know, they state, and Achille Mbembe literally makes the point, right, that becoming black is becoming a broader condition of the world, and with that he talks about subjugated humanity, right, like being less than human, and that means we need to fight that in a more broader, in a more structural sense of the word, vis-a-vis hegemonic power, but in the process not forget that there are differences, and that then also means, I would say, accepting to some degree, right? I wouldn't say racist nature, but that's something I would maybe ask back to you, how you would, you know, bring those two together. But I would say that the basis of dealing with trying to, you know, deal with structural racism is to accept difference. I mean, the last thing that, I mean, the most horrible thing I think most black people think whites can do is to say, I don't see color, right? I mean, that's absolute bullshit, you know, like, there, you know, we are all, I mean, let me just put it really bluntly and then shut up. We are all racist in one way or another. And we need to deal with that. The question is, how do we deal with that? And how do we find each other across difference? How do we accept that we have ingrained, right, structural inequalities that we have benefited from across race, across gender, across age, across so many things, across, you know, the difference in education, etc. And how we deal with that politically, I think that is the key question going forward, not by pretending it doesn't exist, but by exactly, you know, like confronting it head on, and then putting it in bigger contexts, histories, and in relation to different positionalities. I'll leave it at that.
Okay, thanks, Bram, for a very comprehensive response. So we have about 15 minutes left. So I would invite, if anybody in the audience has questions, to raise your virtual hand or post your question in the chat. In the meantime, I would perhaps give the opportunity to Erik, Melanie, or Knut to respond if you have any responses to Bram, to any of these points that he made. Yeah, Knut?
So keep it short, but thanks, Bram. In much agreement with what you say. Looking forward to reading that article on that you've written about post-humanism as well, because or the modern human turn, you said, while I'm skeptical of much of it myself, I think it is possible to do exactly what you are asking for within those frames as well. Because as you say, capital in a way is more than human in a sense, if you want to use that language. And looking at how that is transformed today is quite an important task, which I'm really interested in myself. But I agree with you. It's for instance, the project I'm running now is called ecological globalization, and we use a more and exploring ecological change to more than human world systems. Capital and humans and posthumans and more than human in the same term. But I agree with you that most of that scholarship is almost apolitical in a very disturbing way.
Anybody else? Yeah, Melanie? You have to unmute.
Sorry. I was looking something up quickly and then I had to re-maximize Zoom. So yeah, I mean, I completely appreciate what you've said, Bram. I mean, you know, I'm a scholar who is obviously by appearances lily white. So, you know, I think our own positionality and what we can say about race, we do need to be careful about that. I mean, I guess what I would say is that there's good work sort of problematizing even whiteness as, you know, as a category, as a racial category. And I know that you know this work because you do cite some of it, right? Like Melissa Stein and Dawn Foster, or in Zimbabwe, David McDermott Hughes, you know, you cite their work, right? And I mean, I guess the other thing that I would say is that, you know, you're keen about sort of highlighting the problems of capitalism, but, you know, I think there's also a role, maybe especially for white scholars, to talk about the problems of white privilege and white supremacy, right? Whether one sees that as sort of integrated with capitalism or not, I mean, that's a huge debate in and of itself in the field. But yeah, doesn't hurt to maybe point a little more directly to that, in my opinion.
Yeah, Erik.
Maybe just to say that I really agree with that, and in that article I do really like tackle that head on. I didn't do so much in the book because I felt, yeah, the book is taking a bit of a different turn and towards more broader discussions about environmental crises, but in the article I do take that head on, but also sort of juxtapose some work by Wilderson III on Afro-pessimism. And what Achille Mbembe is arguing, and I think Wilderson III takes it a bit too far, right? So he says violence against Black is ontological and gratuitous, right? And that's really an incredibly strong statement. And so when you read his book on Afro-pessimism, you know, that was literally the most depressing read I've, you know, done in the last 10, 15 years, and I've read depressing stuff. And but I think he's wrong. I think he is wrong. I mean, if that is the case, then what? Then nothing. And that's what he's arguing. That's literally what he is arguing, right? And others are as well. And I can't. I'm not in a position to say that, you know, like I think they're right to do that. And maybe they, you know, they need to do that. But from my perspective in South Africa. And maybe there's a difference between South Africa and the US here as well. You know, I think, you know, most of my friends in South Africa are actually not white, and my wife is not white either. They don't agree with that at all. They want to fight for the fact that they can overcome some of it, accepting that much of it is still very problematic and structural, but not ontological. And there's a bit of a discussion. So for me, those discussions are really, really intriguing, I must say. And I think what we really need is more of those voices to come and push those debates even further and make a lot of people feel really uncomfortable.
Erik, did you want to come in as well?
Yeah, just briefly. First, I would like to say that Bram, I really enjoyed listening to you, how you engaged with our comments, and I was thinking, how nice is it to meet you? Because I have done the sort of opposite I'm coming from the other side. I was trained as a hard ecologist, and my process of deconstruction was the contrary that you had, and we now seem to be meeting somewhere in between our process of self-disciplinary deconstruction. No, so that's very nice. I was thinking, you know, why I find very interesting. So why are now critical social scientists actually like yourself, but also Bruno Latour, in the last few years starting to say, hey, actually truth maybe matters after all, and we need to engage with it. And I wonder if it has to do a little bit with this kind of pendularity of epistemological discussion. So you cite Frankfurt a lot in your book, and I found his book, I read it many years back, Bullshit, very fascinating. And there he comes with a very troubling idea, that actually all this emergence, I don't think this is in conflict with your claim that post-truth is an expression of power of platform capitalism, but maybe it's also intertwined with other dynamics that come before this platform capitalism. And Frankfurt makes the case that this bullshit, and as he calls it, and eventually post-truth, can also be, you know, not a direct product of, but facilitated by an epistemological climate that has been 50 years devoted to deconstructing truth and so on. No? So I'm interested in the idea that, you know, maybe this is the point we realize we push this a little bit too far, and we have to sort of readjust a little bit in the engagement with truth. No. So when you have like some of the most powerful countries in the world being governed by people that claim that climate change is a communist conspiracy, then you realize that maybe actually science, you know, that we have been criticizing for decades, actually we may have, you know, recognized the role that it can have. Not only, and here's where I would like to make this last point. I do not think truth is only a powerful instrument to criticize hegemony and power, but it can also be a powerful instrument to defend positions, emancipatory positions that have been achieved through struggles. No, so I think this is, we have a tendency to always criticize power and hegemony. But I think the idea that we believe nowadays that, you know, the idea that enslavement and raping are not appropriate practices, I would say they are quite hegemonic ideas nowadays. I'm very happy for that hegemony. And I think truth can be sometimes also used to defend the achievement of long-term emancipatory struggles. No? So just a little bit, it's also, we also see now Bruno Latour saying, hey, we actually have to defend science when we have Trump and these guys jumping into the picture. No? So a little bit that reflection of maybe why many of us are now suddenly feeling a need in this post-truth era to actually get back a little bit to truth.
We have one comment in the chat from Paul Visborg. Perhaps I'll just read it, or can you see it, Bram?
Yeah, I see it now.
I'll just read it. Thanks. Excellent all. Bram, when making and speaking truth to power, what are key normative ideas for you? Like life, equality, solidarity, rights, or other comment on the ethical normative? Maybe some perspectives became more or less co-opted than others.
Mm-hmm.
We only have about 5 minutes, so but yeah, you may want to respond quickly to that as well before we find, and to the other comments in 3-4 minutes before we close.
Yeah, very, very short. And then first of all, to thank Erik for the comment. And I mean, it is really nice to see coming from both sides, right? So yeah, maybe there's some hope, in this crazy world that we are in. But it goes to show that and for me, that is one of the powerful things that Hannah Arendt says, right? Like, understanding is a journey. It starts with birth and ends with death. And that's a beautiful thing. It's incredible. And I still think that is such a powerful thing. And we need each other in that process and these kind of discussions. So I would just want to thank you for your incredible contributions and just for now leave it at that, because we don't have much time. Paul, yeah, those are, I mean, key normative ideas in speaking truth to power. So in the end, in the book, I think the way you put it here is really, really important. And I, now kind of realize perhaps this is again something I could have gone into a little bit more. What I do say in the book is that these kind of normative ideas are situated, I think, in between, again, the solid rock of certain bigger issues that like the truth, about the environmental crisis, that I think, and structural inequality, that we need to take very seriously and confront head on. So these are for me things that give me direction, right? That help me in terms of my politics, and also then in terms of my normative ideas. But that doesn't necessarily mean that you automatically speak truth to power. Because in the end, I also say there is, speaking truth to power depends on both your own positionality within particular contexts coming together with how you say things that make the emperor, that make everybody see that the emperor is naked. And I think the examples are around us of people that do that quite nicely. Of course, right, in Scandinavia, with the youth movement and others, I think that they have been doing that quite effectively and really powerfully. And the idea is not always that you necessarily always have to agree with that, And I know that's not a question to an answer to one of my normative ideas, but it opens up space for change. And for me, that is really important. But in that process, the dialectic between critique and understanding and giving direction to change is still always critical. And that is what I wanted to end the book on. And maybe this then becomes part of the next discussion.
Okay, thanks a lot, Bram. We really appreciate you taking the time with us. And I think many of us have learned a lot by reading your book and also in this seminar. And thanks also to Erik, Melanie, and Knut for engaging so nicely with Bram's book. I think this was a good start of the book seminars at the Political Ecology Forum. So yeah, thanks, and thanks to you all for attending. And there is a new book seminar actually on Tuesday with about Hanne Svarstad's and my book on political ecology, and it's the same time at 10 on Tuesday. And you will find, if you haven't seen the link, or you can actually register on the Political Ecology Forum's website, which is politicalecology.space. There is a registration form for that. So that concludes this seminar. So again, thank you all, and especially to Bram for joining us today. And yeah, we'll keep in touch.